Chapter 18, Blood, Screencast 1. This chapter is focusing on blood, and it is the first of 3 chapters that addresses the cardiovascular system. Here, the primary emphasis will be on blood. And remember back in AMP1 when you were introduced to various connective tissues, and blood falls under that category. It is a connective tissue that is continuously being regenerated within our body. And I quite often think of it as the ultimate connective tissue because that's really what it does. It's basically connecting our body for the most part. If we look at some of the things that are going to be moving within blood, we are going to find gases, we're going to find nutrients, hormones, but also we're going to find waste products. So keep in mind when we talk about transport is going to involve delivery, but it also has to pick up metabolic wastes that need to be taken away from the cells that produce them. Blood will be transported through the cardiovascular system. The organ that is responsible for creating the pressure gradient is the heart, and we'll talk about the heart as a pump in the next chapter. Arteries are those vessels that transport blood away from the heart. Veins bring blood back to the heart, and capillaries are those vessels that actually allow for exchange between blood and the tissues within our body. Now, the components of blood are 2, and those are going to be formed elements and plasma. Formed elements, these are actually going to be cells or cell types that will be suspended in the fluid component. They include erythrocytes or red blood cells. Their primary function is the transport of respiratory gases in the blood. We have leukocytes or white blood cells. Their job is to protect us from pathogens. And we have platelets, and their job is in hemostasis. Plasma is the fluid component of blood in which these formed elements are suspended in. And what we're going to find in plasma, in addition to formed elements, are going to be plasma proteins and dissolved solutes. This diagram here is focusing on the primary characteristics of our formed elements. First, when we look at erythrocytes, you're not responsible for memorizing the size. For the most part, what we do want to know is they do account for the majority of the formed elements that we are going to find. Their job is the transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide. We'll address that a little bit later. And then also the lifespan of a red blood cell is approximately 120 days. The next formed element, once again, are going to be white blood cells. They are made up of neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils, monocytes, and lymphocytes, and their primary job is protecting us from pathogens and their role in immunity. Then we have platelets, and their job is basically in hemostasis. When we look at the smallest, they're going to be platelets. They are about 1/4 the size of a red blood cell. Then we're going to have red blood cells, and white blood cells are actually going to be the largest, and they typically are the only ones that we consider to be true cells because they have all of the characteristics we expect to find in cells, including all the organelles. Now, we talked about transportation previously. Now, blood will be transporting formed elements, dissolved molecules, and ions. So keep in mind we're talking about carrying oxygen from and carbon dioxide to the lungs throughout the body. The transport of various nutrients, hormones. Also, it's going to be how we get rid of heat and various waste products. Protection is a dual function. We have the white blood cells and plasma proteins, and they protect us against pathogens. So there is an immune function associated with blood. But also we have platelets and other plasma proteins that are protecting us from blood loss, and that is going to be a process known as hemostasis that we'll be introducing in a later screencast. Other functions include regulation of a number of conditions of the body. One is body temperature. Blood absorbs heat from body cells, especially our muscle. Heat is released at skin via blood vessels. Another thing that blood helps regulate is body pH. Blood will absorb acid and base from body cells, and blood also contains chemical buffers. I do want to talk a little bit about the importance of why the body regulates both temperature and pH as tightly as it does. And this goes back to the overall structure of proteins. And remember, the three-dimensional structures of proteins and how they're folded is due to hydrogen bonds. Hydrogen bonds are not very strong. I like to think of them as attractive forces, so they can be easily disrupted by high temperature or extreme pHs, either pH too high or too low, and that protein will be denatured under these conditions. So that is why our body regulates these two things as tightly as they do, and blood plays a very important role in regulating both body temperature and body pH. It also plays an extremely important role in fluid balance. Water will be added to blood from the GI tract, so it will be absorbed in. Water will be lost through urine, skin, and respiration. And then fluid is actually exchanged between blood and the interstitial fluid. So what is going to allow this to happen is that blood contains proteins and ions which help maintain osmotic balance, and that's a really big part of fluid balance. Now here, this is looking at general characteristics associated with blood. There is going to be a color difference depending upon oxygen or deoxygenated blood. Oxygen-rich, which is found primarily in the arteries, will be scarlet, whereas dark red found in the veins, and that is oxygen-poor. Typically, we have about 5 liters of blood within our body, so think of that as 2.5 2-liter bottles of pop, if you're not familiar or all that familiar with the metric system. It's relatively viscous, so we've heard that saying before, blood is thicker than water. And it's basically 4.5 to 5.5 times thicker than water. And keep in mind, this is whole blood. If we look at temperature, normal temperature is approximately 38 degrees centigrade, and pH of blood is going to be 7.35 to 7.45. So keep in mind, this means blood is slightly alkaline. It is not neutral. Now, here we're basically looking at the process in which blood is centrifuged, and you actually see blood separated into its various components. Whole blood, through that centrifugal process, will be separated into erythrocytes. This is the bottom red layer. It accounts for about 44% of whole blood. The buffy coat, this is within the middle. It's very thin, accounts for 1%. This is the middle layer, has a gray-white color, and this small buffy coat is actually composed of white blood cells and platelets. Plasma, always described as straw-colored, accounts for about 55% of whole blood. So what I do want you to be comfortable with is the general percentages, with plasma being approximately 55% of whole blood, the buffy coat less than 1%, and erythrocytes about 44%. So those are things that I want us to remember. Now, if we look at plasma, 92% of plasma is water. An additional 7% by weight will be various plasma proteins, albumins the most, then we'll see globulins, fibrinogen, and then a number of regulatory proteins that will be dissolved in blood, and also numerous solutes, electrolytes, nutrients, respiratory gases, and waste products, and together, all of that is found in whole blood. But remember, plasma accounts for 55% of whole blood, red blood cells 44%, and leukocytes and platelets account for the remaining 1%, and they are found in that buffy coat once again. Now, here we're basically looking at what the hematocrit is, and technically the hematocrit is the percentage of volume of all formed elements, but we're going to go with the clinical definition, and that is going to be the percentage of just red blood cells or erythrocytes. And keep in mind that makes sense because that accounts for the majority of formed elements that we are going to find in any given blood sample. Now, there is a significant male-female difference when we talk about hematocrit. The normal range for males is 42 to 56%, whereas females, it's going to be 38 to 46%. Probably one of the primary differences that we're going to see responsible for a lower hematocrit in women is the amount of testosterone we find in males that causes a greater amount of erythropoietin to be produced by the kidneys. And that is responsible, we'll find out in a little bit, for the production of red blood cells. Other factors, especially when we're talking about premenopausal women, is loss of blood through menstruation. Now, there are a number of things that we are going to find in plasma, and this particular table here is talking about them. We talk about water, and water is acting as a solvent, so it will be suspending and dissolving things that are in blood. Albumin, this counts for about 58% of plasma proteins, and one of its primary jobs is to exert osmotic force and maintain fluid within the blood. So it contributes to the viscosity of blood. And also there are going to be some transport proteins that albumin is going to be responsible for carrying. We have globulins. Let's just think of these primarily as our antibodies. We have fibrinogen, and in this form, that GEN ending means that it is inactive. And fibrinogen, once activated, is responsible for the clotting process. We have some regulatory proteins, and those are going to be various enzymes and hormones that are dissolved within blood. And then if we look at remaining solutes, we'll have various electrolytes, such as sodium, potassium, calcium, and so on. Various nutrients, glucose, cholesterol, fatty acids. And then we'll have respiratory gases. There will be some oxygen dissolved in plasma, not very much. The majority of oxygen is going to be associated with hemoglobin, and this will be addressed later. And carbon dioxide, some of it will be dissolved in plasma, some of it will be bound to the hemoglobin, and some of it will actually be converted to bicarbonate ion. Then we basically have a number of waste products, such as lactate, creatinine, and urea. And once again, once they are in the blood, they'll eventually be removed from the body. Here are the typical electrolytes that we are going to find in arterial plasma. So sodium, potassium, calcium, and hydrogen. Those are really the biggies. And there'll be some other ions such as chloride, bicarbonate, and phosphate, which also will play important roles that will be addressed at a later date. Now, here are some common molecules that we expect to find in the plasma. They are going to be glucose, and that is a primary fuel for cellular respiration so that we can produce ATP. Various amino acids. There'll be lactate, lipids, cholesterol, HDL, VLDL and LDL, triglycerides, and phospholipids. So all of these are things that we actually expect to find in blood. You're not responsible for how much, and generally not their function, as we will be talking about a lot of their functions later on as we move through this course. Now, there are a couple of things that I want us to keep in mind with the process of hemopoiesis. And hemopoiesis is the production of formed elements. It takes place in red bone marrow of certain bones within our body. A good example would be the ileum. Basically, they're going to be stem cells, and there are two general lines, and those lines are going to be the myeloid line and the lymphoid line. Now, when we look at formed elements, the only formed elements that are originating from the lymphoid line will be lymphocytes. All others, so red blood cells and all other white blood cells except for lymphocytes, will be formed from the myeloid line. That is what I want us to be comfortable with from this particular slide. A little bit later, we'll talk about things known as colony stimulating factors, and they are specific chemicals whose job it is to stimulate the process of hemopoiesis. Now, the next few slides are going into a lot more detail about the production of formed elements, and I'm going to point out a few things that I think are actually important. When it comes to the production of red blood cells, I think it's important to know what are some other things that the body needs in the production of red blood cells. Examples will be iron, certain B vitamins, and amino acids. So all of those are necessary when we're talking about the formation of red blood cells. When we look at leukopoiesis, this is going to be the process or the production in how white blood cells are formed. And this will involve the maturation of granulocytes, monocytes, and lymphocytes. And eventually, we're going to see the development of white blood cells. Remember, the majority of our formed elements are coming from the myeloid line, and the exception to the rule will be lymphocytes. They are coming from the lymphoid line. And as I said, when we talk about lymphocytes, they're coming from the lymphoid stem cells, and they eventually will be differentiating into B cells and T cells eventually. Some may actually become natural killer cells. We'll talk a lot more about those when we do chapter 22, or the immune system, and that is the last chapter that we cover in this class. How platelets are formed is through the process of thrombopoiesis, and they originate from something known as a megakaryoblast. And the important thing that I want us to remember here is platelets are basically going to be cell fragments. Okay, so they're not true cells either. So that's something to keep in mind overall.